So the mean number, the mean is 34. So that's your HO. Your alternative hypothesis is the mean is not 34. So a type 1 error is when you conclude HA when H naught is true. So when you conclude HA, that's the same thing as rejecting the null when the null is true. So if you conclude HA, you're concluding that the mean is not equal to 34 when in fact the mean is 34. So the sentence that says we conclude the mean is not 34 when it really is 34 is this one. A type 2 error is when you conclude H naught when HA is true. And really, concluding H naught, you actually aren't proving that H naught is true. You're just failing to reject H naught when HA is true, means when H naught is false. So really, you're failing to reject H naught when H naught is false. So you're concluding H naught, but what H naught is, we can see up here, H naught is that the mean equals 34 when in fact, in reality, the mean is not 34. So concluding that the mean is 34 when it is not 34 is right here. Conclude that the mean is 34 when it really is not 34. So it's this one. Okay, at most 60% of Americans vote in presidential elections. So at most, think of if you have at most $5 in your wallet. At most is less than or equal to, so at most 60%. So that's your null because it contains the equal sign. Your HA is P is greater than 0.60. A type 1 error is when you conclude HA when H naught is true. Now, concluding HA is the same thing as rejecting H naught when H naught is true. So concluding HA, that's concluding that P is greater than 0.60, or there's sufficient evidence to suggest that P is greater than 0.60 when in reality P is actually less than 0.60. So concluding that it's more than 60%. Okay, so look at the keywords. It uses more than and at most. Greater than is more than. Less than or equal to is at most. So you are concluding that the percentage is more than 60% when in fact it is at most 60%. So we want something that says more than, it's this one. We conclude that more than 60% when in reality, or the actual percentage, is at most 60%. A type 2 error is when you conclude H naught when HA is true. And really, when you conclude H naught, that means you're failing to reject H naught and if HA is true, that means HO is false. So you're really failing to reject the null when the null is false. So you're concluding H naught. H naught is P is less than or equal to 0.60 when P is actually greater than 0.60. So remember this one, they used at most, and greater than, they used more than. So you're concluding that the percentage is at most 60% when in fact it's more than 60%. So we conclude that at most 60%, less than or equal, when in fact it's more than 60%. All right, for part C, the mean starting salary is at least 100,000. So at least is greater than or equal to 100,000. That's your null. Your alternative is that the mean is less than 100,000, the opposing view. A type 1 error is when you conclude HA when H naught is true. So concluding HA is the same thing as rejecting the null when the null is true. So you're concluding that the mean is less than 100,000. That's what HA says. When H naught, when the mean is actually greater than or equal to 100,000. So the words they use are less than and at least. So this one's the less than, and at least is the greater than or equal to. So you're concluding that the mean is less than 100,000 when in reality, or when in fact, it is at least 100,000. So you want something that says less than and then at least. So you're concluding that the mean is less than 100 when in reality, it's at least 100. A type 2 error is when you conclude H naught when HA is true. And the more correct way to say that is you're failing to reject the null when the null is false. Because if the null is false, HA is true, right? So you're concluding the null. The null is saying that the mean is greater than or equal to 100,000 when HA is true, the mean is less than 100,000. And the words for greater than or equal to is at least and less than. So you want something that says you're concluding that the mean is at least 100,000 when in reality it's less than. So you want at least first and then less than. So it's probably this one. We conclude that the mean is at least 100 when in fact or in reality it's less than 100. Okay, so 29%. So P equals 0.29. So that is your null. Your alternative is P is not equal to 0.29. So a type 1 error is if you conclude HA when H naught is true. So you're concluding that the P is not equal to 0.29 when P actually is 0.29. So you're concluding that the portion is not 29% when in fact, no, that's is the same. So it's not 29% when in reality it is 29%. A type 2 error type 2 is if we conclude H naught when HA is true. So you're failing to reject the null when the null is false, really, is what that's saying. So concluding H naught is that P, H naught is P is equal to 0.29. HA is P is not equal to 0.29. So you're concluding that the null, you're concluding that the percentage is 0.29 when in fact it is not 0.29. So that's this one. We conclude that it is 29% when in fact it is not 29%. Okay, fewer than 5%. So P is less than 5%. So for this one, P is less than 0.05, so the opposing view would be greater than or equal to 0.05. This is your null, this is your alternative. A type 1 error is if you conclude HA when H naught is true. And really what that's saying, the more correct language would be you are rejecting the null when the null is true. So to conclude HA is saying that P is less than 0.05 when in reality P is actually greater than or equal to 0.05. So the language they use is fewer and more. So you're concluding that the percentage is fewer than 5% when in reality it's 5% or more. So fewer when the percentage that do is really, so I think it's this one, let's read it. We conclude that fewer than 5% when the percentage that do is really 5% or more, yes. A type 2 error is when you, so a type 2, we're going to conclude H naught when HA is true. And the more correct language is you're failing to reject the null when the null is false. If the null is false, that's why you're favoring the alternative. So you're concluding the null. The null says that P is greater than or equal to 0.05 when in fact P is less than 0.05. So we conclude that not fewer, so we conclude 5% or more when, no, so it's this one. We conclude that 5% or more, that's greater than or equal to 0.05, when in fact fewer than 5% do. So the mean number of cars is more than 10. So the mean is more than 10. So that's your alternative. Your null is the opposing view, which is less than or equal to 10. So a type 1 error would be to conclude HA when H naught is true. More correct language is to reject the null, which is why you're favoring the HA. Reject the null when the null is true. So you're concluding HA, which is saying that the mean is greater than 10, when in reality the mean is less than or equal to 10. So we conclude that the mean is more than, you need something that says more than 10. So this says not more than, we don't want that one, not more than. This one says more than 10, so good, it's starting off more than 10, when in reality it is not more than 10, it's actually less than. So it's this one. This one doesn't work because it says more than 10 and more than 10, which would be a correct decision. So you're concluding that it's more than 10 when in reality it's not more than 10. A type 2 error would be to conclude HO when HA is true. And what that means is you're concluding the null, or you're failing to reject the null when the null is false, and that's why you're favoring the alternative. So concluding the null is mean less than or equal to 10 when the mean is greater than 10. So you need to find something that says less than or equal to 10, which means not more than 10. So not more than 10, so it could be this one or this one, not the ones that say more than, because we are less than or equal to 10. We're concluding that it's less than or equal to 10. So not more than 10 when in fact it is more than 10. So it's this one. We conclude that it's not more than 10, less than or equal to, when in fact it is more than 10. Okay, about half of Americans prefer to live away from cities, so P equals 0.50. And that would be your null, and your alternative would be P does not equal to 0.50. So a type 1 error would be to conclude HA when H naught is true. So you're rejecting the null when the null is true. That's a type 1 error. So concluding HA, that's saying that P is not equal to 0.50 when in reality P is equal to 0.50. So we conclude, no, we don't conclude that it is half. So that would take away that. We conclude is not about half when it is not about half. That is the correct decision. Not about half when it actually is about half. A type 2 error would be to conclude the null when HA is true. And what that's really saying is you're failing to reject the null when the null is false. And that's, once the null is false, that's really why you're favoring the alternative. But concluding the null, that you're concluding that P equals 0.50 when in fact P is not equal to 0.50. So you're concluding that the percentage is half. So the ones that say is half is this one or this one, when it is not half. So it's going to be this one. Europeans have a mean paid vacation time of about 6 weeks. So the mean is 6, that's your null, and the mean is not 6, that's your alternative, HA, HO. So a type 1 error is to conclude HA when H naught is true. So to conclude HA, that's saying the mean is not equal to 6, when in fact the mean is equal to 6. So is not 6, that looks good, is not 6, but it is 6 would be this one. Okay, so we conclude that the mean is not 6, that's what this is saying, when in fact